Her husband's kin cut off her braid and turned her out into the hail barefoot. The hail came sideways off the ridge. I had my collar up and my hat pulled low, and I still caught it on the back of my neck, little stinging pellets like someone throwing gravel. The cattle didn't like it either. They'd been moving well all morning, but now they were starting to bunch and turn their heads, and I knew if I didn't get them to the draw before it got worse, I'd spend the next 2 hours finding strays in the dark. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the open ground between 2 cedars, not running, not crouching, just standing in it. No coat, no boots, feet on the frozen mud. Her hair, what was left of it, was cut short and ragged on one side, like someone had taken shears to it in a hurry, and longer on the other, and she was bleeding a little above her ear. She was watching me ride toward her the way a person watches something that probably won't matter. I pulled up. The hail clattered against my hat brim. She said something in Lakota first, then shifted to English. "I am not going back to that house." I said I didn't know what house she meant. "The Cutter place." She said it like she was naming a disease. "My husband's family." I looked at her feet. They were already going blue-gray at the toes. I looked back the way I'd come, and then toward the draw where my cattle were already drifting without me. I said, "You can ride behind me or you can stay in the hail, either one." She came around the horse without another word and put her hand on my arm and stepped up behind me like she'd done it 1,000 times, which I'd find out later she had. Her name was Walks Far. That was the English version, what her father called her when she was small because she'd follow him out farther than the other children ever did. Her full name in Lakota I couldn't pronounce right, and she didn't offer to teach me until much later. Her husband had been a white rancher named Cutter, dead 8 months, and his brothers had waited exactly that long before deciding she was in the way of the inheritance. They'd cut her braid, a Lakota woman's braid, which is not a small thing to cut, and put her outside in what she had on and told her to go back where she came from. Where she came from was 3 days north, and her father had been dead 5 years. I didn't know any of that when I helped her down in front of my camp at the draw. I just knew she needed a fire and something dry to put on her feet. My name is Jonah's Crew. I was 46 years old that winter, and I ran cattle along the Powder River breaks for a man named Steen who I'd worked for since I was 23. I had a bedroll, a change of clothes, a cast iron pan, coffee, salt pork, and a dog named Hitch, who was more trouble than he was worth and who I would not have traded for anything. I had a camp tent I'd learned to pitch fast, and a line of fence posts I was supposed to be checking for Steen until the weather broke. I did not have a plan for a woman with blue feet and cut hair who'd been thrown out of her house in a hailstorm. What I did was what I knew how to do. I got the fire up. I pulled a pair of wool socks out of my kit and put them on the ground next to her. I poured coffee. I didn't ask her anything for a long time because I could see she needed to be still first, and she sat there with her hands wrapped around the tin cup and her feet held toward the fire, and she didn't talk and neither did I. Hitch put his head in her lap, which he almost never did with strangers. I took note of that. After a while she said, "You are not going to ask me to leave?" "Nope." "Why?" I thought about it. Nowhere to go in this weather. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. She had very direct eyes, dark brown, and she was not a woman who would let you say one thing when you meant another. I could tell that already. And she said, "And it's a rotten thing they did," I said. "The braid, that's a rotten thing to do to a person." She looked back at the fire. Something went out of her shoulders, a held tightness. She didn't thank me. I didn't need her to. She stayed 3 days while the storm held. She slept in the tent. I had enough canvas to rig a second linta for myself, which I did without being asked, and she watched me do it and didn't comment. She helped with the cattle without being asked, too. Just appeared one morning in the gray pre-dawn light with her makeshift boots. She'd done something clever with a piece of canvas and some cord, and started cutting through the brush toward the south end of the herd where 2 heifers had drifted. She knew cattle. She read them the way I read them, not by noise, but by where their attention was pointed. On the second day she told me about her father. He'd been a horse trader, half Lakota himself, worked the country between the Black Hills and the Powder for 30 years. She'd grown up in the saddle. When she met Cutter, he was buying horses from her father, and she said this plainly, without self-pity, she thought he was a better man than he turned out to be. He wasn't cruel, he just wasn't strong. And when he died his brothers were, and she wasn't surprised, not really. She'd seen it coming. She'd just been waiting to see which direction it would come from. I asked her where she'd been planning to go before she ended up standing in my path. She was quiet for a moment. I was not planning, she said. I was just walking. I understood that. I'd had years that felt like that, just walking. No destination, just motion, because stopping meant the thing behind you caught up. She asked me one evening what I was out running. I didn't answer right away. I was cutting up a piece of salt pork for the pan, and I kept cutting it. Then I said, "What makes you think I'm out running something?" "You don't look at that ridge," she said. She gestured with her chin toward the North Ridge, the direction of Steen's main buildings, the direction of the nearest town. "Every day we're here you look everywhere except that direction." I kept cutting. "My wife is buried up there, about 4 miles. She said nothing, just nodded once. "She died 2 years ago. I still work for Steen because I can't figure out what else to do with myself, and I can't leave because I can't figure out how to leave her, and I can't look at that ridge because—" I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. "Because then you have to feel it," she said. "Yeah." The fire popped. Hitch shifted in his sleep. The hail had turned to rain by then, and the rain made a soft sound on the canvas above us. She said, "What was her name?" "Me." She said it once quietly, like she was repeating it for someone who couldn't hear anymore. "Me." Then she picked up her coffee, and we sat there, and neither of us said anything else, and I was grateful for that in a way I couldn't have explained. On the third morning the weather cleared, and I knew she'd have to move on, and I knew I wasn't going to just point her down the road and call it settled. I wasn't built that way. I told her there was a woman in town, a widow named Farley, who took in boarders, and that I'd ride with her that far and make sure she was settled before I went back to Steen. She looked at me steadily. "You don't have to do that." "I know it." "Then why?" I pulled my hat on. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I want to, and you can argue with one of those but not both." Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. The ride into town was 4 hours. We didn't talk much. The country was beautiful after the storm, the way it sometimes gets, everything washed clean, and the sky that particular blue that makes you think of nothing in particular and everything at once. The cattle grazed along the valley floor, and the creek was running fast and brown and loud, and Hitch ran alongside happy about the whole business. I got her settled with Mrs. Farley. She had $6 that she'd kept in her boot, the one thing she'd managed to hold on to, and Mrs. Farley was a practical woman who didn't ask a lot of questions and had 2 extra rooms and was glad of the company and the income. I stood in the doorway of the boarding house for a minute after the arrangements were made. Walks Farr was standing in the hall with her few things, and she looked at me and I looked at her. "I'll check in," I said. She said, "All right." That was all. I rode back to Steen. I don't want to skip over what came next, because what came next was the worst 6 weeks of my life since me died, and what she did in those 6 weeks was the whole thing, the part that matters. But I have to get to it in the right order. About 10 days after I brought Walks Farr to town, I was fixing fence up on the north end of Steen's land. The ridge I never looked at. I don't know what made me look that day. Maybe the weather, maybe something in the light. I looked up and I could see the corner of me's grave marker from where I was standing. Just the corner of it, white stone above the winter grass. I sat down in the mud next to the fence post I was supposed to be setting, and I didn't move for a long time. I don't know how long I sat there. The light changed. Hitch came and pressed his flank against my leg, and I put my hand on him and still didn't move. I'd been carrying this thing, the 2 years of not looking at it, not touching it, just working and moving and keeping busy, and it was like sitting down in that mud broke something open that I hadn't known was about to break. The grief came up all at once, the real grief, the kind you keep underneath the working kind, and I just sat in it. I didn't go back to camp that night. I don't know what I was thinking. I built a small fire near the ridge and sat next to it. I didn't eat. The next morning I was still there. That's when things got unsteady. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, wasn't thinking right. It was the kind of thing that, once you've let it in, you don't know how to make it stop. On the second day, Steen rode out to check on the fence line and found me there. He's a good man, Steen. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he went back to the ranch and sent one of his hands to cover the fence work and left me alone, which was either wisdom or concern, maybe both. I don't know when Walks Far heard. I don't know who told her. Small towns talk, and maybe Mrs. Farley heard from the hand who'd gone out, or maybe she saw Steen's expression when he came back through town for supplies. I don't know the chain of it. What I know is that on the third morning I looked up from that cold fire and she was there. She'd ridden out on a horse she'd borrowed from Mrs. Farley's neighbor, who apparently had let her take it without much question, and she'd brought food, biscuits wrapped in cloth, dried meat, coffee in a stoppered tin that was still warm. She sat down across the dead fire from me, and she didn't ask me what was wrong or try to make me talk. She built the fire back up. She poured the coffee. She put food in my hands. I looked at her. "You didn't have to come out here," I said. My voice sounded rough and strange, like I hadn't used it. "I know it," she said. She looked at me levelly. "And I wanted to, and you can argue with one of those, but not both." She used my words exactly, flat and plain and right back at me. I looked at the fire. Something cracked loose in my chest that might have been the last piece of the thing I'd been holding too long. I pressed my hand over my eyes for a moment, not long, just a moment, and then I put my hand down and I breathed. She didn't look away from me. She didn't pretend she hadn't seen. She just sat there and let it be what it was, and that was the most careful and the most generous thing any person had done for me in 2 years. We sat by that fire a long time. She told me about her father dying, not as a comparison, not to make my grief smaller, just to put something of her own alongside it. She said grief was like cold. You couldn't think your way through it or work your way through it. You had to let it move through you the same way cold did, slow and complete, and come out the other side. She said, "You have been running from it. It caught you. Now you sit with it until it finishes." I said, "And if it doesn't finish?" She looked at me. "It finishes," she said. "It does not go away, but it finishes." I believed her. I don't know why I believed her exactly. Something in the way she said it, plain and certain, not gentle, just true. We camped there that night. She'd brought enough for that, too. She'd thought it through before she came. We ate, and she told me more about her father, about the horse-trading routes, about the country north of the Black Hills in spring. I told her about me, how we'd met, the first winter we'd spent on Steen's land, the way she laughed at things she thought were funny in a way that made you want to tell her more funny things just to hear it. It was the first time I'd talked about me since the funeral. It didn't feel like bleeding. It felt like something that had needed air. Hitch slept between us, which was his way of voting on the situation. I went back to work the next day. She rode back to town. I checked in at Mrs. Farley's that Friday, then the Friday after that. We had coffee in Mrs. Farley's front room, which was proper, and talked. Walks Far had found work with the dry goods man, keeping his accounts, which surprised some people in town and didn't surprise me at all. She was sharp and she was precise, and she didn't have any patience for carelessness. The dry goods man was careless about his ledgers, and she fixed that in a week. He gave her a raise without being asked, which I respected. The Cutter brothers came to town once, about a month in. I don't know what they thought was going to happen. They came into the dry goods store while Walks Far was there, and one of them said something. I wasn't there for this. She told me later, flat-voiced, like she was reporting something about how she ought to remember who she owed and what she was. She told him she owed him nothing and she was the woman keeping Reinhardt's accounts, and if they needed dry goods, they should make their selections and pay for them and otherwise leave the store. The older one, she said, started to say something else, and that's when Reinhardt himself came out from the back and told them in a loud and public voice that Walks Far was his employee, and he'd thank them to speak to her respectfully or not at all, and if they had a problem with that, they could take their business elsewhere and he'd be fine. She said she'd stood very still while all that happened, not because she was frightened, but because she was waiting to see if she needed to handle it herself. She decided she didn't. When she told me this, I thought about the Cutter brothers and what I'd like to say to them. I didn't say what I was thinking. She could read it in my face, though. "It is handled," she said. "I know. But I'd like 5 minutes," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I know," she said, and then quieter, "It means something that you want that." Spring came. The cattle work shifted and I was moving more, covering more country, but I made sure to be in town on Fridays. Mrs. Farley's front room, coffee. Sometimes I stayed for supper, which Mrs. Farley seemed to think was a fine development. One Friday in April I was late. I'd had a heifer in trouble down by the South Creek, and by the time I got to town, it was past dark. I went to Mrs. Farley's anyway, and she let me in and said Walks Far was in the sitting room and went back to her kitchen with a particular quality of discretion that I was coming to appreciate. Walks Far was reading by the lamp. She looked up when I came in. "You're late," she said. "Heifer." She nodded and set the book down. I took off my hat and held it. I had something I'd been meaning to say for a while, had tried to work out the right words for it, and then given up on finding the right words and decided to just say it plain. I said, "I'm not looking for someone to replace me. I want to say that clear first. What I had with her was what it was, and I don't want to pretend otherwise." She waited. "But I think about Friday every day of the week," I said, "and I think about you every day. And I'm 50 years old in August and I've been alone long enough." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp threw soft light on her face. She had her good braid back. It had grown enough to braid again, though it was shorter than it had been, and she wore it over her left shoulder the way she always did. "I think about Friday every day also," she said. "All right." "It is not a small thing," she said. "What you are asking, I had one husband, you had one wife. We are not young." "No. But I think we are honest," she said, "and I think that is harder to find." I said, "Yeah, I think so too." She stood up from the chair. She crossed the room and she put her hand on the front of my coat, not a grip, just a placement, her palm flat against my chest, and she looked up at me. Her eyes were steady and direct the way they'd always been, and there was something in them that was not soft exactly, but was warm, a kind of warmth you earn rather than just find. "I am not replacing anyone either," she said. "I am choosing you, you understand that." Something settled in me. Not a sudden thing, a slow thing, like ground hardening after a long thaw. "I understand," I said. I put my hand over hers where it rested on my coat. We stood like that for a moment, her palm against my chest and my hand over hers, and the lamp burning steady, and outside Mrs. Farley moving around in her kitchen like nothing unusual was happening, though she knew perfectly well what was. Walks Far said, "You can ask me properly on Sunday." "All right. And you should bring Hitch. He should be there." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in a while, not a polite laugh, a real one that came from somewhere below the chest. She watched it happen with something close to satisfaction. I did ask her on Sunday. Hitch was there, he approved. We married in June in Mrs. Farley's backyard. which was the best yard in town on account of a lilac bush that Mrs. Farley had been tending for 12 years and which was in full bloom that morning. Reinhardt came. Steen came. Mrs. Farley cried, which she said she never did, and then cried more, which nobody mentioned. I have a photograph from that day. She is standing next to me and her braid is over her left shoulder, and she is looking at the camera with those level dark eyes, and I am looking at her. I'm not looking at the camera. Anyone who sees that photograph knows where my attention is. I don't have a lot else to say about the years that came after except that they were good years. Hard sometimes, the way all years are, but good. She kept Reinhardt's accounts until we had enough to put a down payment on a small place of our own, west of Steen's land, 30 acres and a creek and a barn that needed work. I fixed the barn. She planted things. There's a ridge behind our place. I can see it from the kitchen window. I look at it now without flinching. Walks Far knows what that means. She doesn't say anything about it. She just puts coffee on and we stand there in the morning light, her shoulder against my arm, both of us looking out at the same ridge, and it's enough. It's more than enough. It's the kind of thing I'd stopped thinking a man like me would get to have again. But she knew better than that. She saw it before I did. That's her way.